Wow, what an unmitigated disaster last night was, and today continues to be for the GOP. I was not alone in expecting last night to be a very good night for the Republicans. It is only the historical precedent. Every time you have an incumbent president, they're the first midterm election of their presidency. You know, it's their first term, and it's the first midterm election. That is usually very bad for the president's party. Yet, we looked last night, and I couldn't imagine things going much better for the Democrats than they have. Now, it's not like the Democrats are going to gain seats in the House and the Senate. I don't think it was that bad for the Republicans. But you always, every time, except for 2002, right after 9/11, the president's party loses seats. It's just a matter of how much. In 2010, the president's party lost a lot. Okay? That was a pretty bad election for the incumbent president's party. That was the biggest wave election since going back to 94, right? And a lot of people expected this year to be even bigger than 2010. Yet it wasn't. It was weaker than the 2018 midterms were for Democrats, which, in and of themselves, they were all right. They weren't nearly as bad as this, but they were great. By historical standards, the 28 midterm was not like a blue tsunami. The Democrats, they retook the House. Good for them. They weren't able to pick off the Senate. They weren't able to, win the governorship here in Florida. I mean, that was the thing that I was watching the most in 2018. But it was like, Florida still held on, and the Democrats are going to call this a good year for them. Now, this year, you look at Florida and go, oh, well, that you shouldn't even look at that. Florida's not a swing state. Well, in 2018, we still thought Florida was a swing state. And the Democrat did nearly win. I believe DeSantis won by about 30,000 votes. But, the GOP here, Rick Scott was able to flip a Democratic Senate seat. So, that to me was what I think of when I think of 2018. It was not a blowout for the Democrats. But then you have this year, which the Republicans, it seems like, are going to gain hardly anything. It's hard for me to find anywhere that the Republicans are going to make pickups here. What are they going to have a 5-seat majority in the House? I mean, right now the Democrats have a paper-thin majority in the House of Representatives. The Republicans, if they win a few seats, they got a majority. Okay, good for them. But that majority is going to be probably even thinner than the one that the Democrats currently have right now. The Republicans are losing pretty much every toss-up toss-up race and all the seats, of course, that lean Democrat. But in a true wave here, you would expect the Republicans to win every seat that's leaning Republican. They would win every toss-up seat, and they would even pick off a few lean Democrat seats, maybe a safe Democrat seat here or there. You'd have a couple upsets. That's what it means when you have a really good year, especially when you've got inflation at a 40-year high. This is the worst inflation since the 1970s, especially when you look at shadow stats and the honest measurements of inflation that are consistent throughout our history. We're on the brink of World War III. We're sending billions and billions and billions to Ukraine while Americans can barely make ends meet. And when all that is happening under a president whose party controls both houses of Congress, you would expect a pretty major backlash. This is much worse than anything that was going on in 2018. Things were going pretty well in 2018, and Trump's party, when he was the president, still felt a pretty substantial backlash. Now, it wasn't as bad as it could have been because, things were going pretty okay in 2018. But yet this year, what's the big stat that everybody keeps repeating? The exit polls showed that 73% of Americans think that the country's on the wrong track. Oh, and I almost completely forgot to mention 2 years of medical big pharma fascist tyranny, where you were forced to wear masks and not do anything. You were forced to stay in your house. You were put under house arrest, and you were nearly compelled by law in many places to undergo a certain medical procedure that many people did not consent to. I mean, that's insane. You would think there's got to be some backlash to that. Yet all the governors who were the strongest on that matter, who pushed that the hardest, such as Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan, they were rewarded. You know, Whitmer won by more than she did in 2018. She won more. I believe that's correct. Because she had a really big, I mean, she won by like 10 or 13 points or something ridiculous last night. And I don't think she won by that in 2018, which was a Democratic year. This was supposed to be a pro-Republican year, and you have Whitmer, after all the terrible things she's done. You know, I mean, I think worse than, I think it's safe to say Whitmer did things that are worse than anything Rick Schneider, who was a terrible governor before her, did. You know, and that's why Whitmer, you know, was swept into office. Was people were mad at the bad performance of Rick Schneider. Well, her performance is just fine. So, it's hard to explain from a common sense, you know, standpoint. And I'm not a special pleader for the GOP. Most of these candidates, I think I've been open about. I don't like them. There are some that I think are promising, like Masters and Lake. But like, you know, Tudor Dixon in Michigan that was running against Whitmer, a blank slate to me. I have no idea. She could be good. She could be bad. I have no idea. Oz probably would be pretty bad. Mastriano, maybe he'd be pretty good. I don't know enough about him. I guess I would lean towards saying he was probably good because he was hated by the establishment and they denied him funding. You know, Herschel Walker, I mean, he's okay. He seems like a nice guy. That's about it. I don't have any strong feelings about Herschel Walker. And you know, a lot of people are going to look at what happened and say this doesn't make any sense. You know, this must be election fortification. I have to say, this year I don't think that's the case, because this is across the board. This is in every state other than Florida, which I didn't even mention. Oh my God. See, that's the thing. Things are so bad everywhere else. To me, I've already brushed over Florida. I mean, Florida was a big shock at first. Like, I knew that DeSantis was going to do big. I was expecting him to be over 10 points. It was just a matter of how far over 10 points. And he ended up with his lead almost 20. I think it was right at 19 points something, but basically a 20-point lead. And he flipped every county in the state except for, you can count them on one hand, Broward, Alachua, Orange, Leon, and Gadsden. That might be 6, actually. No, that's 5. Yeah, so you can count them on one hand. Other than that, every county in Florida is red, and by a pretty decent margin. The closest county that the Republicans won, I think, was Palm Beach, of all places. Home, of course, to President Donald Trump, but Palm Beach is reliably Democratic, has been for decades. Dade County, home of Miami, went for DeSantis and Rubio, who also won by a lot, not as much as DeSantis, but in the teens. Very, very impressive margin for Rubio. You know, Dade County is now red. Hillsborough County is red. Pinellas is red. Duval is red. These are all the major cities in Florida, save for Orlando, Tallahassee, the capital. And I guess you can count Gainesville if you want to. It's not a really big city. It's a college town. That's where the University of Florida is. So, I mean, it is very blue, but it's not really that big. We have a lot of places that are bigger than Gainesville that are very, very red in this state. You know, in Gadsden County, of course, there is no major city. I mean, is Chattahoochee in Gadsden? So this was a very big deal. And it wasn't just Cubans and Venezuelans, because Osceola is also red. And Osceola, that's where Disney World is. You've got a lot of... The Hispanics there usually are like more like Puerto Ricans. You don't really have a ton of Cubans prowling around Osceola County. And Puerto Ricans typically pretty reliably Democratic. There's a lot of Puerto Ricans up in Central Florida, kind of across there, what they call the I-4 corridor. I never really liked that term. I don't like when, you know, you have geography based on a road. But, you know, the topography is very flat in Florida, so we don't really have, you know, landmarks to divide certain parts of the state so much. But anyway, to me, what that just showed is that the appeal, the flipping here, I mean, it was across the board, across demographic groups. It was not just, the Cubans, it was not just high turnout amongst Cubans and some Venezuelans. That's not what this was. And honestly, I don't know how much of this can hold. I mean, I look at, Hillsborough going red by 9 points. It's like, come on. In 2022, is that a sustainable thing? Are we going to keep seeing that in every election? It's hard to believe. But it might just be that the kind of people who move to Florida now, because we've had, massive population growth in just the last couple of years since COVID. Things are, there was never heavy traffic around where I live. Now, I have to sit through multiple light cycles to get through every intersection. It's bumper to bumper going to work and from work. And I live pretty close to where I work. I don't have a commute. I don't go to a different city. I work in a business in my town, and it's just there's no other way to say it other than there's so many more people than there ever have been in my entire lifetime, and they all showed up in the last couple of years since 2020. And so I know that this is, that's indicative of what's been going on across the state. Our population has grown significantly. Maybe it's just that, the people who are coming here, maybe they're overwhelmingly in favor of, DeSantis and the Republicans, and, hate all of the stuff that I was talking about, like lockdowns and vaccine mandates and pharma tyranny and wokeism. And so maybe they're just, turbocharging the Florida GOP's support. Because how else do you explain Florida getting redder than ever and everywhere else in the country being uncharacteristically, stubbornly Democratic? Now, I think Rich Barris has an interesting theory. He's a pollster. He's a numbers guy. His hot take, which I'm sure he'll have a more defined position once he's had time to drill down into the data. His hot take was that he thinks that this is a result of Republicans underperforming amongst white working class voters, which is probably true. I think that there's been certainly been no time since 2016 that Donald Trump has been less relevant. I'll put it that way. And the white working class awakening was Trump's coalition. And a lot of these states that we saw shift and become more competitive, like Pennsylvania and Michigan, which were so shockingly, to most of us, Democratic, and were completely uncompetitive if you look at the margins. If friggin' Fetterman winning by over 5 points or so, and Shapiro, the gubernatorial candidate, beating Mastriano by, who was a very Trumpy character, very Trump endorsed. His claim to fame was that he was a big stop the steal guy. He lost by 13 points. So I don't know how exactly, how you blame it, but the Trump coalition in 2022 is dead. That's the only way I could put it, other than in Florida. In Florida, I guess you could say, Trump won Florida in 2020 by more than you would expect you normally wouldn't expect the loser in a presidential election, and I'll put loser in air quotes, to win in Florida. That just normally doesn't happen. And two, you wouldn't expect him to win by, 2.5 points or so. That's a very decent. That's a respectable margin in Florida, and it of course was quite a bit more than what DeSantis won it by in 2018. In 2018, DeSantis barely scraped by with 30,000 votes, and you have Trump win by 2.5%, and then now you have DeSantis winning by 20%. And I'll tell you, he didn't do it on the back of soccer moms. You don't get 68% of the vote in Lee County over 70% in Collier, and 55% I think it was in Dade, and 55% in Duval, and I think he got like 53% in Osceola. You don't do that by just winning over a couple extra soccer moms. There's not that many of them, and there were never that many of them, because the Republican theory is kind of, oh, you see, we used to do well in a lot of these states, and they're slipping away, like Georgia and Colorado, and what we have to do is we have to get back some of those voters that we lost. That's the idea. And so your high watermark is what the Republicans were able to accomplish a few years ago. That's your best case scenario. Whereas in Florida, we're seeing DeSantis winning much more than Republicans did a few years ago. He beat Jeb Bush's landslide from 2002, in which he won by 13 points. You know, again, a year after 9/11, his brother was a wartime president. You know, it was kind of like a proxy election for. It wasn't even the Iraq War at that point. It was just the Afghanistan War, you know, and the War on Terror. It was like, you know, if voting against Jeb Bush in 2002 would be like saying that, you know, you would have shot Kennedy yourself. It would have been like voting for the Ayatollah, and yet DeSantis put another 7 points on that margin. And you look around to these other states like Georgia and Arizona so far. I mean, we don't have, well, I shouldn't say that. Arizona, we don't have enough data on yet. There's a lot left to come in on Arizona. For the record, I think it's pretty obvious Kari Lake is going to win. Masters is less certain, but I think he's still got a good chance. From everything I've seen, there seems to be a lot of votes left out there, and the later stuff that gets counted is all going to be heavily favored towards the Republicans. Laxalt and Lombardo, they could. I mean, there's always the fortification risk with Nevada. You know, the New York Times has got these rolling out these trial balloons talking about how Nevada, there's hundreds of thousands of mail-in votes that haven't been counted yet. It'll take a while, could take a week or two. You know, we'll see what they do with those. So, you know, that one's kind of up in the air. Masters, you know, I talked about the fortification in Arizona yesterday, how I thought that, you know, my initial reaction was that they'll be able to take out Masters, but probably not Lake. Again, at this point, looks like they're not going to be able to take out Lake, and Masters is more up in the air. And so as of right now, I mean, really, if Laxalt wins, Masters should win. It's hard to imagine. I mean, Nevada and Arizona, to me, are very similar situations. But if one of them wins, you're back to the status quo, which, again, is terrible for the Republicans. They should have been hoping to make gains this year, not just get back to even. So I guess all I'd say, my predictions at this point, I do think Laxalt is going to pull it out. I think the Republicans will start from a 50-50, and then it's a matter of, okay, then we have to watch for Masters. Is Masters going to be able to take a lead with the remaining votes? If he does, that'll put the Republicans at a paper-thin 51-seat majority, and then it'll come down to Walker in the runoff December 6th. That could either be a 52nd Senate seat, or, again, you're left at 51-49. I think it's interesting that if you look at the statewide Republicans up for election in Georgia, they performed inversely to how pro-Trump they were. So you started out the overtly the most anti-Trump guy was obviously Brad Raffensperger. He is a sworn enemy of Trump and his supporters. He made it his mission as the Secretary of State to try and make sure that Trump lost. He also played a role in the impeachment, and Brad Raffensperger won by like 10%. He beat the Democrat by like 10% by being a never Trumper. Then you had Kemp, who was kind of like, he was implicitly anti-Trump, but he never really, he kind of tried to stay above the fray a little bit. He never, went out and started trashing Trump like Raffensperger did. He didn't try and push himself as a anti-Trump guy. And then he governed as a relatively okay Republican governor. I always give Kemp credit. He was the first person to open after the lockdowns. I think he opened restaurants in March of 2020, and he said, you know what, this lockdown thing doesn't really make a lot of sense. I give him a lot of credit for that. He was anti-lockdown before DeSantis. So he won by half as much as Raffensperger by being a neutral. So being neutral on Trump. So the guy, I'm not saying that this is a causation, but this is an interesting correlation. The overtly anti-Trump candidate wins by 10 points. The implicitly anti-Trump but pretty neutral guy wins by 5 points. The only overtly pro-Trump candidate on the ballot was Herschel Walker. And as of right now, he's kept Warnock under 50%, but he's still trailing by like 1.5 points or something. And so he did not win. So you could say that his margin is like 0%. He's right dead even pretty much with Warnock. So the more pro-Trump you are, at each stage, it takes 5% off of your margin for victory as a Republican. At least that's the correlation. And you can't ignore that. I'm not going to come out and say that I think that Trump is the problem and Trump is why they lost, because Trump was not heavily involved in this election at all. I think he did way too little. He didn't help people. Whenever Trump came out, he just talked about himself, and you almost didn't know that there was an election going on. So I don't think the problem is that Trump was too involved and that people are tired of seeing Trump. At least that's not the impression that I got. Even going back to 2020, which, supposedly Trump lost and that was bad. And, Republicans did well down ballot with Trump at the top of the ticket. This time, they did, I think, worse than 2020. Now, things might shake out a little bit better. Maybe, again, I think at the end of the day, Arizona and Georgia probably will look better than they did in 2020. Nevada already. Nevada does. Nevada is doing better. But Nevada was not competitive before Trump. Remember that. Nevada was a decently blue state for quite a few years. Last person to win it was Bush 04. In 2016, people were not talking about, Jeb Bush going in and winning Nevada, if he were to be nominated. Pennsylvania, people want to blame Trump, maybe for winning Pennsylvania. Yeah, it was Trump's guy who lost. Oz lost to a vegetable. Think about that. I don't want to say that too loud. I don't want the YouTube censors to catch on to it. But again, that was Trump's pick. But Pennsylvania was not a competitive state. We weren't talking about really Pennsylvania before Trump. Now you had Pat Toomey. Give you that. You had Pat Toomey, you had Rick Santorum before that. So there were Republicans who have won in Pennsylvania. And so maybe you want to argue that 2016 and 2020, when it was very close, that those were flukes, and that era is over. Others have argued that simply too many people have left Pennsylvania and moved to Florida. That's possible. But either way, whether you want to make it about Trump or not, I don't think that appealing to more soccer moms is going to make things better. I don't think that that's what the Republicans did wrong here. They seem to have performed plenty well amongst the soccer moms. I think the problem is probably what Barris says, and that is that the Trump coalition that was energized back in 2016 is not energized now. And maybe you don't bring the same people back in that Trump did back then, although it seems like a decent enough plan. But you need to bring new voters in, because coalitions change. That has been, I think, the theme of the last 6 years of American politics. It is the evolving Republican coalition. And 2022 seems to have been a bit of a step backwards in most states. Because, these things always change. And the Reagan coalition in 1980 was brand new. And here we are over 40 years later. And a lot of the Republican Party is still trying to cling on to that same coalition. You can't. They change. The interests, relative interests of people, you have people align themselves differently politically, throughout time with different parties, depending on, who best serves their interests and who they have things in common with. So with all that said, I do think that the big loser yesterday, politically, was Donald Trump. Because DeSantis, the one guy that Trump seemed to show some animosity towards, other than, of course, Brian Kemp, who also won quite handily, DeSantis was the biggest victor of the night. And that in and of itself is a loss for Trump now that Trump has aligned himself against DeSantis and made it clear that DeSantis, is his enemy. That was a rebuke of Trump. If Trump was right, DeSantis should have either lost or barely squeaked by. If Trump's will was really that powerful, if he was that in touch with the voters. And obviously, what DeSantis has in Florida is a winning coalition. It is sufficient. Are you going to be able to build the same coalition in every state? No. But, a state like Texas, I think, could. And Texas, went all right for Republicans, but it could have gone a lot better. It's funny, you have an ex-Trump press secretary, a presidential press secretary. This is a woman's job. Kayleigh McEnany was to be the chief propagandist for Donald Trump when he was president for a time. And now she's saying Trump needs to stay the hell away from the Georgia runoff, and DeSantis needs to go campaign with Walker. And, the logic is pretty clear. Well, her logic is she probably wants a job with DeSantis, thinks that he's the next meal ticket, and so she's throwing Trump under the bus, trying to get DeSantis' attention, be his press secretary at some point. That's probably her personal calculus, but the logic of her statement, if you take it in a vacuum, is that last night, Trump's big endorsements, Herschel Walker, Dr. Oz, I think Don Bolduc, if I remember correctly, I think he was like a big Trump guy. He was somebody who worked in the Trump administration. They were duds. And DeSantis, he went out with a bang. And so what he either did or did not do didn't work for this cycle. And I think mostly it's what Trump didn't do. I don't think he put in much of a fight to win this election at all. He seemed pretty detached from this election. He seems, yes, stuck in the past, but mostly just stuck talking about himself. Whereas DeSantis is focused on things that people are talking about these days. He's very much in tune with culture war issues, which riles people up. It can get a base excited to go out and vote. And I mean, just look at, some of the sound bites from his victory speech last night. He said, Florida is where woke goes to die. That's not somebody who's playing to the middle like Brian Kemp. Make no mistake, DeSantis is very calculated. I don't think it comes from the heart with him. He's a guy who does his research. He has a lot of people around him who try to, keep their ear to the ground. And that's how he crafts his public persona. So with that said, I think that the Georgia runoff is going to be very interesting. I think this idea of DeSantis campaigning with Walker not only makes a lot of sense, but it brings this, I don't even know if I want to call it a feud between him and Trump, because I feel like that's playing into the media narrative too much. This whole dichotomy, let's say, between Trump and DeSantis, it brings that to the front. And will Trump try and go to Georgia? Will he try and be, buddy-buddy with Walker and be a very public supporter of his campaigning with him if DeSantis does it? Because, again, it's not just that DeSantis won 20 points, it's that he's right next to Georgia. There's probably a lot of people in Georgia who, know who DeSantis is. I think that DeSantis is probably much more well-known in Georgia than he is in, Idaho or something like that, or Montana. And so it makes sense. You have a southern governor go right next door to campaign with another southern Senate candidate in a runoff. Popular guys getting together. Some of DeSantis' popularity rubs off on Walker. It's pretty straightforward. So there's a lot to learn from this election, and this is not the end of what I have to say about it. I'm going to have to do a lot more thinking, a lot more research. And with that said, I will see you folks back here tomorrow.